Good afternoon, Miamians. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. Today, as part of the Alumni Association's webinar series, we present Ballot Initiatives and Democracy when Lawmakers Override Voter Decisions. Joining us today is Ann Whitesell, Ph.D. She is a professor of political science and associate director of the Menard Family Center of Democracy here at Miami. Welcome to you, Ann. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon.
Hi, Molly. Thanks for having me.
Of course, we're happy to have you chat a little bit about this with us. Just a quick reminder for our live viewers, you can submit questions throughout the webinar today by clicking the Ask a Question button under your video. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann to tell us a little bit more about what all of this means for us.
All right. So can we see the slides? We're good?
Yep, we got them.
Okay, excellent. All right, so thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm really excited to talk about this. As Molly said, I'm Ann Whitesell. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at Miami. I've been at Miami since 2020, and I'm also the associate director of our Menard Family Center for Democracy. So if you're interested in that, you can check us out on Miami's website. So for today, just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. So first I'll go over what ballot initiatives are in case you're not familiar with them. We'll talk about how initiatives become law. Then we'll talk about how that whole process is being undermined. And then we'll talk about the larger consequences for democracy. So to first start off, there's a lot of different terms that are used when we're talking about ballot initiatives. Sometimes you hear it talked about as direct democracy. So we're just going to go with some definitions first. So the first thing to note is that there are what are called direct and indirect routes to ballot initiatives. And so this first definition I have up here are direct statutes. So these are laws that citizens propose to go on the ballot. So petitions go out, you get signatures, and then they go directly on the ballot. So you can see on the map here, all the states in red, they're the ones that allow this. If you're in Ohio, you might be thinking that that's weird that Ohio's not in red. We're going to get to that in 1 second. But you can see that it's very common over in the western states. I can explain that more in detail if you're curious, but there's a historical reason for that. All right, the second is an indirect statute. And so again, this starts off with citizens who gather petitions. They want something to be on the ballot. But what happens first before it goes on the ballot is it goes to the legislature. And so the legislature has the option of taking it up as a bill, just a regular piece of legislation, and they could pass it. And then the voters don't need to vote on it. And so it's basically citizens saying like, hey, can you do something about this? The legislators can then say, yeah, we agree. We should do something about this and pass a law. If the legislators don't want to take it up, then it goes on the ballot. So you can see here, Ohio is shaded in red here. And so if you're an Ohio voter, you might know that you vote on statutes. That's how it gets on the ballot here, is that the legislator has chosen not to take it up. We also have what are known as referenda, which are very common. And so what happens here is that instead of starting with citizens, it starts in the legislature. So lawmakers create a bill, and then they seek the approval of the voters. So voters can either approve the bill or veto the bill. Sometimes this happens because legislators know that it's kind of a controversial issue and they want the voters to weigh in on it so that they don't have to take kind of the final stance. And then finally, we have amendments, right? And the important part here is that these change the state's constitution. They're not just laws. This is going to be important when we talk about how the process is being undermined, because it's much harder to change a state amendment than it is to change a statute. All right, so now that we've gotten all those definitions out of the way, how are ballot initiatives created? So there's this long process. Again, we're here talking about things that start with the people. So we're not talking about referenda. But the first thing that happens is there has to be a preliminary proposed petition. And as I'll talk about in a second, All of this varies by state. That's the beauty of American democracy, is that we basically have like 50 different forms of democracy. And so each state has a slightly different process for this, but there has to be a proposed petition that gets sent to a state official. Right? And depending on where you are, you might have to get a certain number of signatures to get that proposed petition. Right? Then the state reviews the petition, makes sure it meets all the requirements. For some states, that means that they review the language of it. For some states, they have rules that the petition can only be about one issue. So you can't have a petition that says, we want to legalize both, marijuana and increase taxes by this amount, right? You can only have one single issue on the ballot at a time. And then after the petition gets reviewed, the ballot title and the summary is prepared. This is pretty important because most people are not going to read the full text of the proposed bill. So the summary and the title are going to be what most people go off of when they cast their vote. And when people are talking about the vote leading up to it, that's what most people are going off of. Because again, most voters are not going to spend the time to read through all of the language. So you're looking at just the summary. After all of that, so that's kind of before behind the scenes work, right? Then you have to go out and get the signatures. And again, we'll discuss this in a second here, but how many signatures you need really depends on the state that you're in. After you go out and collect the signatures across the state, you then submit that petition with all the signatures to the state. The state then has to verify all of those signatures. And there's lots of different processes for that, again, depending on the state. And then finally, you get through all those steps and the initiative appears on the ballot. And then the voters have their say on whether they want to support or reject whatever is being proposed. So as I mentioned here, right, the process and the requirements differ by state. So this is really important to remember if you are moving from state to state and suddenly you don't have the opportunity to vote on a constitutional amendment or an initiative. Only half the states in the country do this. There's that part to remember. There's also, again, the ease of which you can get things on the ballot differ by state. And again, we'll talk about this in a second here. Right, so when we talk about what can differ, some of this is the review process. Right, so in some states, the legislature or other officials will work with the petitioners to make sure that the language is correct. So one of the critiques of ballot initiatives is that oftentimes lawmakers might think that voters aren't well enough informed to create policy. If you have a process where before the petition gets on the ballot, you work with the petitioners to make sure that the language conforms with existing law, and then you can kind of ameliorate some of those concerns. Right? So again, some states offer that assistance, others do not. Who writes the title and the summary changes depending on the state. If you're in Ohio, you might remember that there's been some controversy in recent years. Frank LaRose is the one who ultimately has the authority to decide on the title and the summary. This is a partisan position, so it brings into question the language that's being used. And there's political science research that shows that the wording does matter because, again, for most voters, they're not going to read the full text of what is being proposed, right? They're reading the title and the summary. So the language being used can make a big difference in how people vote. And then finally, the signature requirements can differ quite significantly. So basically, if some states have a pretty low bar to pass in order to get on the ballot, and then other states have a higher bar. So here I have a graph showing you some of these signature requirements. And so this graph is showing you the relationship between the voting eligible population in the state and then the number of signatures required for citizen initiated statutes. Right? So as you can see, the general trend is that the more people you have in the state, the more signatures you need, which is because the signature requirements tend to be a percentage of the electorate. But again, it varies a lot based on the state. Sometimes it's like 5% of the electorate, sometimes it's 10%, and it even varies more than that. So sometimes it's 5% of the people who voted for governor. Sometimes it's a percentage of people who voted for the Secretary of State. Right? So again, the requirements differ quite a bit. So if we're looking at these states, right, California is up here. Right? California has a huge population, right? And so they require a lot more signatures, right? But then we have other states where if you were to draw a line, right, kind of a straight line, you'd see that some states have more signatures than we might expect, right? Because they have higher requirements, right? So again, these are the states that require 10, 15% of the electorate to sign on to a petition before it can move to the ballot. All right, so that brings us to how the process is undermined. So there's 3 ways. When I talk about this in my class, I talk about there's basically 3 different points in the process in which the process can be made more difficult, or the voters' will can kind of be undermined here. So the first point at which this can happen is that we can make it more difficult for ballot initiatives to just get on the ballot. Right? So you're blocking access to using that form of policymaking. Right? The second is that you can allow ballot initiatives to get on the ballot, right, but then make it more difficult for those initiatives to pass. And then the third is that the ballot initiative will pass, but then the lawmakers will either repeal or alter the content of the initiatives. Right? So again, all 3 of these are happening throughout the country. One thing I want to preface the rest of this talk with is that this happens in both Democratic and Republican-leaning states. Right? What the political science research shows is that this typically happens in states where this is allowed, right? So where we don't have strict rules around not interfering with the voters' rules. It also happens when lawmakers feel that their power is being threatened, right? So again, that can happen in both Democratic and Republican states, right? And especially for this third point of repealing or altering content, this tends to happen when the vote is close. Right? So if there's a landslide victory, the lawmakers typically are less likely to overturn what happened. But we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so talking about restricting use of the ballot, right? So basically just keeping things off of the ballot. There are a couple different ways that states have made this more difficult. One of them is just the technical requirements for people who are circulating petitions, who are organizing to get something on the ballot. And so some of this is very specific formatting instructions. If you ever had a professor who said, you have to use 12-point Times New Roman font, 1-inch margins around the page, it's stapled, right? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, is having very specific instructions and saying if you don't follow these, then everything is void. Right? And so this photo that I have here, this is taken from a news story, but it's talking about South Dakota, because South Dakota requires, when you circulate a petition, to have all the signatures on one sheet of paper, and the text, the full text, has to also be on that sheet of paper. It also says that there has to be a minimum font. I think the minimum is size 14 font. Right? So as you can see, right, this creates like this big, huge poster size paper. The other thing that they mentioned is like you can't have things stapled together. So in Ohio, and this is actually common in quite a few states, when you circulate a petition, you need to have the text of the petition or the summary of the petition with you so that people who are signing on to it know what they're signing on to, which is totally legitimate, right? Totally reasonable. In Ohio, it says like you can staple these things together. South Dakota says you cannot staple it together, you cannot tape it together, you cannot paste it together. It has to be on one sheet of paper, which again, it creates like this weird large poster that petitioners have to walk around with. You can see that it's folded, right? But obviously makes it more difficult for people. The other way that they kind of create a higher bar of entry is with filing fees. So the filing fee in Ohio is only $25, which is pretty low bar. But in Montana, it's $3,700, which is quite a lot if you're just a group of people who have an idea. Part of this filing fee is intended to keep like unserious efforts off the ballot, because you can imagine $25, like anyone with an idea could try to get something on the ballot. But the problem with having high filing fees is that you then push organized groups to be behind these ballot initiatives. And that's one of the main concerns with ballot initiatives, is that these are not kind of the grassroots efforts that we thought they were, or that they were originally intended to be. But what ends up happening is you have well-organized advocacy groups, interest groups, who have a lot of money. And so they can file the filing fee. They have lawyers so they can meet all the technical requirements. And as we'll talk about with signature collection, they have a lot of people so that they can go around and make sure they get all the signatures. Right? So in a weird way, it kind of creates this incentive for those with more money, those with more power to enter this process, and discourages those who are less organized to be part of that. As I said, another way that they can restrict use is in the signature collection process, right? So making it more difficult to collect signatures. One of the ways that they do this is by regulating who can circulate the petitions. So in several states, you have to be a resident of the state in order to circulate the petition, which again makes sense. Right? If we're thinking about, we want this to be a grassroots effort, right? We want the citizens of a state to come and kind of organically raise an issue and bring that to the ballot. But it does mean that there are a then more limited number of people, right, who can be involved in that effort. And if you think about states where the state boundaries are kind of less important, right? So people often cross state boundaries. Maybe they're interested in a ballot initiative because it will affect where they work, but not where they live. You can see this in Ohio, thinking about like the difference between Cincinnati and Kentucky. Right? There might be reasons why people would want to help out with a petition in a state that they don't live in. The other way that they make signature collection more difficult is by having requirements on geographic distribution. So often this is related to the legislative districts, meaning that you have to gather a certain percentage of the signatures from each congressional district, or each, depending if it's their state legislature, the state Senate district, or whatever it is. Again, there's a good intention behind this. The idea is that if we think about Ohio and we say, we need 5% of Ohioans to sign on this petition, we don't necessarily want all of those signatures to come from Columbus, right? Or all of those signatures to come from Cleveland and Cincinnati. Right? We want there to be widespread support for this before we put it on the ballot. Right? So in some ways, right, that makes sense, right? That we would have these geographic distribution requirements. And so in Ohio, you have to get signatures in 44 of the 88 counties, right? Which again, is requiring more distribution there, right? But again, the problem with that is it means that for groups that are less well organized, right, for groups that are not well spread out through the state, right, they might have a problem getting those signatures. Right? And especially in states that are very large. So states out west, Montana has faced this problem. It's a huge state. So traveling great distances to get signatures can be really difficult, and meeting that threshold can really be a barrier from getting something onto the ballot. All right. So assuming that you get everything you need to get on the ballot, right? You get all your signatures. The next way that the process can be undermined is by making passage more difficult. So the first way they can do this is by raising the approval threshold. So some states have higher approval thresholds for certain issues. So for example, Arizona requires a 60% threshold when it comes to tax-related measures. This is a big kind of debate in ballot initiatives. Oftentimes legislatures are unhappy when voters have votes on things that have great fiscal consequences, because again, the idea is that voters may not understand the full implications. So the idea is that having a higher threshold, right, requiring 60% of people to approve changes to taxes, would kind of overcome just like the whims of people wanting to change the tax system. Okay. Sometimes there's higher thresholds for constitutional amendments. So in Colorado, for example, they have both statutes and amendments. They require 50% for statutes, 55% for amendments. In Nevada, they actually require you to have simple majorities, so 50%, in 2 consecutive elections. So people have to prove that they really want something to pass 2 times. And in Ohio, we've seen this, right? We just saw this a couple of years ago with Ohio's issue 1 in the special election in 2023, as you might remember. So I have that language here on the right. Again, that was initiated by the legislature. They proposed that we raise the threshold for constitutional amendments to 60% of eligible voters. Voters in Ohio rejected that. 57% of voters rejected that amendment. But again, one example of trying to make that more difficult. The second way that they can make it more difficult is by limiting campaign contributions. So in some states, they limit out-of-state contributions. Again, the idea is that this should be a grassroots effort. This should be for the people in the state. And so we want to limit the effects of outside groups. And that means not getting funding from outside groups. There's lots of different ways that different states count campaign finance when it comes to ballot initiatives. Sometimes states have the same rules as candidates. Sometimes states have different rules than they have for candidates. But those are all, again, ways to kind of make it more or less difficult to get the word out about these things and to increase or decrease the likelihood of passage. The other thing I'll say about that is this idea of banning the out-of-state contributions goes again to the critique of ballot initiatives, that there's a lot of influence from outside groups. And what we have seen is that what gets passed in one state often then gets passed in many other states. In political science, we call this diffusion. And so spreading things throughout the states, and we expect this. But there is concerns that this is, again, not organic, not because people decide like this would actually be good for our state, but because we have well-funded interest groups on both the right and the left that want to impose their political preferences on other states. So they start in one state, and then they just fund campaigns throughout the country. And then finally, we get to overturning the will of the voters. So you get the initiative passed, you think you're in the clear, and then you realize, oh, wait, not so fast. So there are a couple ways that this gets complicated. The first, and I would say probably the most common way, though I don't really have the statistics for that, but is refusing to implement policies or just slow walking the implementation of policies. Right? So the legislature or the governor, sometimes both, might really not like what the voters decided on, which makes sense because the whole point of ballot initiatives is that you're trying to go around the normal way of making laws. And typically what we see is that ballot initiatives are on issues that the legislature is not ready to act on. So it should come as no surprise that then the legislature and the governor might not be so happy about it. So we saw this in a couple states when it came to Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion, it first started after the Affordable Care Act. Right? We saw a lot of states expand Medicaid, several conservative states that did not expand Medicaid. And then their voters decided to try to put it on the ballot to force the state to expand access to Medicaid. What then happened is that in several states, Missouri, Idaho, Montana, I believe, Maine, they basically decided not to implement Medicaid. Oftentimes they said that this was for fiscal reasons. So again, that's a very common reason to not do something, is say the voters didn't understand the fiscal implications of this, right? This is going to cost us way more than we anticipated. And voters don't understand this, and we can't do this, right? Or basically say okay, the voters can say that we need to do this, but we're not going to allocate funding to it. And if the legislature doesn't allocate funding to something, then it's hard to actually implement something. So that happens. Again, there's little that you can do about it except pressure the legislature and the governor when this happens. So in the case of Maine, this was Paul LePage who refused to implement it. And I think he said something like he'd rather go to jail than implement it or something like that. And then he lost re-election, and Janet Mills got elected, and on her first day in office, she enacted Medicaid expansion. So the other way that this happens is by amending or repealing initiatives. So in a lot of states, 11 states, including Ohio, this is allowed to happen without any restriction. So, and this is something they don't tell you as a voter when you're going to vote on an initiative, by the way, this could be repealed at any moment. But the important thing to note here, and this is why I brought up the difference between statutes and amendments before, right? Amending and repealing happens for statutes. It's much harder to happen for amendments, because an amendment is a change to the state constitution. You need another amendment to then undo what happened in that previous amendment. So in a lot of states, again, there's little restrictions on this. In some states, they have time limits, right, where you need to have it implemented for anywhere from 2 to 7 years. And then in California and Arizona, there cannot be any substantial changes without sending it back to the voters. But those are the only 2 states where it's really prohibited. We've seen an example of this in Ohio's recreational marijuana law. Right? So this is what I have on the right here. And you can see they don't call this a repeal. They are repealing parts of what was passed when the voters voted to legalize marijuana. But you can see that it talks about amending a lot of sections, right? Amending, and then repealing a lot of sections. Right? And so this, in some ways, depending on who you talk to, right, this like fundamentally alters the purpose of that initiative and is as good as repealing it. Some legislators might say that they are merely amending it. So kind of open to interpretation. This is a graph just showing you how common these what are called legislative alterations are. Right? So this is amending or repealing. Right? So we have the total number of citizen initiative state statutes, and then in the yellow are the number that have been altered. So you can see like in 2016, about half of those that were passed were also altered. Fewer in 2020, none in 2022 or 2024. I think this is probably just because they haven't had time yet. I would give it a couple of years. Legislators will probably still work to amend or repeal depending on how they feel about this. In 2020, that bill that was altered was Oregon's drug policy, which legalized more drugs beyond marijuana. And then it was, I mean, basically a big policy failure. And kind of, they were trying something out. It didn't work. And so they went back in 2024 and altered it. So again, it took about 4 years for that to happen. So I would wait a couple more years and you might see some things that were passed in recent years get altered in the future. All right. So to wrap up with all this, what does this mean for democracy? Right. So to step back, like a well-functioning democracy requires that there's deliberation. So there's going to be back and forth. Right? In some ways, it's not unusual that voters disagree with elected officials, right? That there be give and take, that we pass a law and then amend it or repeal it, right? That happens. But a well-functioning democracy also requires responsive elected officials. Right? By responsive, we mean that they should be responding to the will of their voters, right? So in theory, if the will of the voters is to pass an initiative, then they should be respectful of that and not repealing it. Right? The problem when we see these legislative alterations, right, when we see amending or repealing bills, is that this is not responsiveness. Right? This then just creates apathy among voters, right? This sense that it doesn't matter if I get involved in the process, or government doesn't pay attention to me, they don't care what I think. Right? It decreases trust in institutions, and we know the trust in government is already very low. So it doesn't help our current situation. But it's also important to remember that ballot initiatives are only one way for Americans to voice their preferences. Right? So again, lots of states don't even have this option. It's important to vote for one. Right? That's kind of your number one way of getting involved, because representative democracy, right, voting for someone who will then represent your interests, is still our primary way of getting policy made in the United States. Right? Voting is still important. Showing up, and expressing your discontent when you don't like what policymakers are doing, right? That's still important, because elected officials, even if they seem unresponsive, right, they still respond to incentives. Right? And so even if it feels like, we're not making the choices that you would want to make, it's still important to get involved. And ballot initiatives, again, are only one way to do that. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Here I am, Anne. Thank you. I'm going to make this a little smaller so we can see each other. Okay, I do have a couple questions for you. So you talked about language in ballot initiatives. Can you explain a little bit about, it seems in my opinion, and in this question, it also was sort of called out the tricky language inside, where no means yes, yes means no. Can you tell us why sort of laws are written that way, and if there's sort of distrust among the voting public for not understanding what it is they're voting for, wouldn't clarity be sort of like a priority? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can explain like the individual choices that are made by people who write the summaries, but I can explain. So what we know is that when there's like a higher level of reading comprehension required, right, for ballot initiatives, and there's been research looking into this, basically looking at, at what grade level is this ballot initiative, right? That confuses the voter, right? And you're more likely to have people just not vote for it, right? In one thing. The other thing that happens is the more complicated the wording is, the more likely you are to rely on the cues that you already have. And so oftentimes when people go into the voting booth, we don't see this with ballot initiatives, right? But you're looking for like a party affiliation, right? And you're oftentimes voting based on what does the party say, right? The same thing can kind of happen with ballot initiatives, but in the sense that you're taking your cues. What did you hear from an ad or something, right? What did someone tell you, a trusted source, or if, again, what did your party say you should vote for? Right? Because the more complicated the language, the less likely you are to read it and kind of internalize it yourself. And so you're more likely to then, again, just go back to, whatever those trusted sources are when you feel like you don't have enough information. I think it is a deliberate choice, right? Whether to make the language complicated or not. We call it framing. So how we package up this language, right? And so it's not an accident when you see questions framed like this. And again, I would look at kind of who, it depends on the state, right? But who is writing the language? If there is partisan actors involved in the writing of the language, right, then that suggests that there might be some motive there.
I thought that was a good question because specifically the marijuana initiative and that language, as an Ohio voter, I know that language was difficult, and I needed to be reminded, what does a no vote really mean? What does a yes vote really mean? So I think probably that's a problem across the country in a lot of states, sort of the unclearness. And
the other thing I'll add to that, just one more thing, is that oftentimes voting on a ballot initiative requires that you know what the status quo is. And so if it's asking you, like, should we change, I remember several years ago, we had, a question in Ohio about like drug possession or something, right? It requires you to know like what the law already is, right? So if it says, should we change, drug possession of this much to a misdemeanor rather than a felony, right? You have to know, like, okay, well, what is currently the law? Right? And does that mean that then we are lowering the standards? Are we raising the standards? And there are some things where, like, again, it's pretty straightforward. Right? When people were voting on same-sex marriage, like, people knew what the status quo was. Right? But for these more technical things, like, you often don't know what the status quo is. So you don't know if you're making things like quote unquote better or worse by voting yes.
Gotcha. I think, yeah, a well-informed voter, I think, goes a long way, but sometimes it's difficult. And I know a lot of people who don't do the research on the front end, but don't feel comfortable maybe like reading it all verbatim and word for word in the voter booth. And I think sometimes that leads to some not clarity, if that's even a right phrase. Let's see, you talked a little bit about it, but Alyssa asks sort of what recourse do we have, when what we voted for sort of gets trampled by the government? Do we issue another ballot initiative, or do we push for that? What are some other ways that we can sort of like get involved on the ground?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in most states, you can have another ballot initiative on the same issue. Right? So, and in this way, it's actually not that dissimilar than like how things work in the legislature. So we're oftentimes, if you're not a political scientist or not someone who just like pays attention to the day-to-day workings of either the Ohio General Assembly or Congress, we see this a lot where like bills get put up for a vote, right? They get rejected and then they get reintroduced. Right? And we see this all the time. And there's, again, always this like give and take. And so in some ways, this is very similar in that like voters approve something, legislators knock it down. Right? You can just reintroduce something. That's kind of an exhausting process, yes. Right? So it's kind of discouraging in that sense to think that like, wow, every time, right, we have to redo this whole process. As I mentioned, the process takes a long time, but that is one way to do it. In some states, there are rules about like how long you have to wait in between ballot initiatives on a certain issue, but in some states there aren't. Again, I think the other thing that it would encourage people to do is contact your elected representatives because they do respond to public pressure. So even if you're in a district and you're the minority in that district, right? You don't agree with the preferences of your elected official, right? They do respond to public pressure. And so that's one way that you can get involved is by like basically nagging them, right? Just constantly reminding them, right? And it's important for them to remember that like there is opposition to them. And on whatever issue it is, it doesn't matter how big or how small, right? It's important to have them be reminded that this is a representative democracy, right? They are representing you. So that would be my first thing. The second I would say is getting involved. Like the more locally I think you get involved, the more you can see the impact being done. And so, if you are frustrated about what's happening at the state level, I encourage you to get involved in what's happening in your town or your city, even your neighborhood, because oftentimes you can see things happen a lot more quickly there. And again, ideally, right, what happens is you have like this grassroots support, or you get people energized, and then you can build from there. But it can be very discouraging when you see the will of the voters thwarted at the state level, going back down to the local level. And the nice part about the local level is you're much more likely to know like the people who hold elected office. So you can, you know who they are. They're probably your neighbors. You see them at the grocery store. They are definitely going to be probably more responsive to you than your state elected official.
Well, and I think that's so important about getting involved locally and feeling like you can move a needle, because I think a lot of us feel we're just one person and the punchiest thing we can do is, go to the voting booth and cast our vote. But, I think sometimes it's good to remind us that we have the capacity to remind our elected officials what our priorities are if we don't feel like they're representing those priorities accordingly. So I think that's such an important reminder for the viewers to find ways to remind our representatives. Let's see, got a couple other ones here. Mark asks, specifically related to the state of California, the California Supreme Court often chips away at various, voter approved propositions. He gives the Proposition 13 as an example. Do other states sort of also run into these kinds of issues, this sort of like strategic dismantling of that?
Yeah. So again, some of this can depend on the state and the process by which things get on the ballot. Because imagine if you're not very well organized group of citizens trying to get something on the ballot. And if you don't have like a legal scholar working with you, you may not know the ins and outs of the state constitution and current law. And so then it would be very easy. Well, not very easy because it's always difficult to pass a ballot initiative, right? But it would be more plausible for you to pass a ballot initiative that then runs afoul of the state constitution or current law. And so I think part of what happens is that groups may not be prepared for potential legal challenges. And that's when you're most susceptible to that, right, is if you haven't kind of planned ahead for that. Right? But if you can be very careful and intentional in your language, right, and you think about these things beforehand, then you're more likely to survive the court challenges. Again, this is why you often see these efforts funded by bigger like national groups, is because they have a legal department and they can check out what the legal implications are and make sure you cross all the T's and dot all the I's. Right? But you're much more likely to have the effort chipped away at if it's people who are not as well informed and haven't, again, thought through all of those implications. So
Great, excellent. Let's see. I have another question here. This says, well, first of all, thank you for your presentation, Acacia says. And she asks, are there ways or key terms that we can look for that help explain the tricky language in these ballot initiatives? She says, for instance, there's issue 2 that's coming up in May. And she says that she personally feels like something might be missing or something sneaky is not included in that. Do you have thoughts or feelings about that?
Yeah, so I mean, my recommendation, and as a political scientist, like I try to be the most informed voter, but like to be fair, it is very hard to be an informed voter. There's a lot of things happening, and especially with ballot initiatives, there's a lot of detail that unless you spend your whole life thinking about it, you're probably not going to catch it. And even if you do spend your whole life thinking about it, you may not catch it. So one of the things that I do is, for any ballot initiative, is try to read multiple sources about the ballot initiative, right? People who have studied it. The League of Women Voters, I'll make a plug for them. They always do a great job of summarizing ballot initiatives. But in general, I find that the more sources that you can get, the better off you are, because, say that you happen to read one that's biased in favor of it, right? Even that, I think, can be useful, because if you understand the bias, then you can see why someone would be in favor of something or opposed to something, right? So, reading the language yourself is useful, right? But first thing, I would not feel like you should have to understand it by yourself, right? Like it's not everyday reading. It's not, things that we come across. So don't feel like you have to just rely on your own brain to understand it. Right? Go and find other sources that are talking about it. Right? And then the more that you have, you can kind of piece together, like, what are the common things that they're saying? Right? And then you can kind of get at, what is the truth there. So that's my recommendation. I mean, in general, for ballot initiatives. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is this is my political scientist, is that I often look at who is funding the ballot initiatives, right? And that can kind of give you a hint as to like what forces are behind it, right? Who's spending money on this?
I think that's such an important point, because I mean, honestly, it was something I never really thought about until the last several years, about where it's coming from and who's behind it, motivating it. And that really does make a difference. I think that's an important point to remember as a voter, as well. Okay, just maybe we've got time for another question or two. And I want to be like a little bit delicate. So when there are controversial bills that have been sort of put forward without a lot of feedback from the public, what is some advice that you might have for organizers who sort of want to rally against, and maybe at some point get it to a place where the general public can have an opinion, rather than it just being something that is plunked down on top of us. Do you have sort of ideas for how to start small? And you mentioned the local community, but I'm thinking as far as like something a little more organized.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea here is that the legislature passes something and we're not.
That maybe not be quite, that maybe gets under folks' skin a
Okay.
little bit.
Okay.
And so, the general public may or may not want to, say, hey, why would you impose this? Why don't we get a voice?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I first of all, I mean, I assume people that are watching this have like at least some interest in politics.
Yeah.
The thing that I always have to remind myself, as someone who spends too much time thinking about politics, is that there are a lot of people who spend zero time thinking about politics. And so there are many people who may not even know that this is an issue, right? Whatever your issue is, whatever the thing is that you care about, right, that you're upset about, there are probably a lot of people who don't even know that this thing is a problem, or that it happened, right? And so this is actually something that I talk to my students about. One of the things that you can do is just educate people on what is happening, right? And encourage people, depending on how comfortable you feel, right? Encourage people to get their own information or provide information about what is happening. I have my students write editorials for local newspapers. They don't have to send them to local newspapers, but they're encouraged to. Right? But to get in that mindset of like, how do you use your voice to advocate on something that you think is important, right? And to educate someone on an issue that they think other people should care about, right? So again, remember that like there's often things that are happening that like we all have so many things happening in our lives. It's hard to keep up with all the things. And if you take the time to just tell people about what is happening, that can actually help a lot. People have mixed opinions on the use of social media for doing this. I tend to be pretty optimistic about social media and the use of social media for change, for advocating, for spreading information. I do think it's a useful source, again, if people don't even know that it's an issue. I think, again, that is like the first step. Right? We can't assume that people know that there is an issue, that a bill has been passed. You have to start at zero, at the ground floor, right, before you ask people to do anything. So people aren't going to show up to a rally, or people aren't going to call representative. Like they have to be convinced as to why this is something that they should care about, and that's a lot of work. But I think it's something just in conversations, and again sharing information, whether it's on social media, over text, whatever. That's something that you can do.
Well, I think it's really important that you encourage conversation, because it feels like a time where it seems somewhat more difficult to have meaningful conversations about some of these things, in this, sort of increasingly polarized world we live in. But, conversation seems to be like where it starts. Like that is the ground level, being able to discuss things with your sort of peers and the other people who occupy the same space in the same state that you do. So thank you for reminding us that it is good to talk to each other, to learn from each other, to understand from each other. I think if we all did that a little bit more often, maybe we wouldn't be having so many of these kinds of discussions. Not that we're not happy to have you, Anne. This is
I'd be out of a job.
No, I don't suspect we'll put you out of the job anytime soon. We do appreciate these helpful hints. Thank you so much. Well, I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you for discussing, this very important topic. We are just really glad that you decided to spend some time with us today. So For those of you who would like to catch this webinar on the flip side, you can do that at Alum LC. I'm sorry, I lost my script here. At Alum LC / Miami OH. There it is right there. So sorry about that. And we thank you so much for being here. Those of you who could only tune in for a little bit, you can see a recorded version of this webinar a little later today, right there at that website that I just butchered. And thank you so much. And we hope to have you back again. Maybe we can move some needles, change some things, and have you back to talk about it.
All right. Excellent. Thanks so much.
All right. Have a great day to you, Ann, and to all of our viewers. Love and honor to everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye.